I'm a bit nervous. Jake has his notebook open on his
So, let's begin. So this is just briefly finding the context, or maybe not briefly, hopefully briefly, of materialism. So before, I was just going to describe, as you've described, the development of creation as such, in that pure consciousness vibrates within itself and produces experiencing, which is the pre-egoic state, which is how nature experiences itself, and children as well seem to. And then from within that, at least in humans and maybe other animals as well, but there develops the natural neti-neti process where consciousness begins to localize itself, separate itself out from the world, but it stays being identified with the body and the mind.
Yes.
The inward-facing path is then to continue the neti-neti process, realize consciousness, which is separate from the body, mind, and world.
Yes.
The outward is then to dissolve that distinction. And then, so materialism seems to come up from the egoic state, which is developed from the pre-egoic state in the duality of the consciousness, body, mind, and then the world. And I think you said before that it makes sense and it's intelligent in a sense because it realizes there's something outside of the finite mind, but it applies that to the objective world. And so we believe there's an objective world that exists outside of the finite mind. So in a sense, we believe there's an object that exists without a subject, which neither can we find in our experience, nor does modern physics agree with. So really in this model, it seems to be suggesting that there is something outside of the finite mind, which we could call nature or the world, but really that's just existing in a sense in the pre-egoic state, that's just the vibrations of consciousness as such.
Yes, there is something outside. There's more to Mary's mind than just what Jane perceives. So Jane is right in thinking there is something more than my finite mind. The mistake she makes is believing that that something more than my finite mind is called matter. Now the mistake that the religious people make, the religious people have the same intuition that the materialists have. There is something more than my finite mind. What is that something more? They don't call it matter out there, they call it God out there. So in fact the duality of the self and the world is really, it consists of three parts, not two parts. It's the self, the world, and God. So that the belief in, so some people call what is outside the finite mind matter. Some people call what is greater than the finite mind God. But both the belief in matter and the belief in an external God are inevitable consequences in the belief I am a separate self. So as such, both the idea of matter and the idea of God are simply extensions of the primary ignorance, which is I am a separate self. But there is, so that's what is false about the materialistic view and the religious view. But there is also something that is true in both intuitions, because the materialists believe there is something absolutely real about matter. And the religious people believe there is something absolutely real about God. They are right. There is something that is absolutely real about whatever it is that is beyond our finite mind, whether we call it matter or God. And the scientists explore what that reality is by investigating matter. The religious people devote themselves to that reality, by explore that reality by devoting themselves to God. And if both disciplines go far enough, they inevitably come back to the one that knows their experience. So eventually, what the problem is when both these disciplines don't go far enough and they stop halfway. So there is something true and something false in the materialistic and the religious points of view.
And so the religious point of view then, believing there's a God out there, that essentially comes down to the consciousness, which is the ultimate reality. The scientific point of view, believing there's some material out there, the material they're really looking for is just really a vibration of God as such, but it's the kind of pre-egoic state, it's the consciousness merged in the experience, it's consciousness which is vibrating within itself, that's what they kind of intuit there as being some sort of form beyond the finite mind.
Yes,
religious people...
Consciousness vibrates itself. Consciousness vibrates within itself. That's called the activity of mind. But in order for that vibration to appear as a world, it needs to be viewed through a particular configuration of mind. So consciousness is vibrating within itself. If you view that vibration through a dog's mind, it will appear as a dog's experience. If you view that same vibration through a human mind, it will appear as a world. In other words, the mind superimposes its own limitations on whatever it knows and perceives. And it perceives the world in accordance with those limitations. But what it is really perceiving is the activity of God's mind, or God's mind if you're a religious person, or consciousness's mind if you're scientific.
Because there's one conclusion that the way I was thinking I was going to draw, but may not fit, is that the world, or nature, as we might say, exists as a movement of God's mind or consciousness, and is in the same place as the archetypes and what Western psychology calls the unconscious.
Yes.
And they're not really separate things.
We could call the archetypes, the archetypal forms, we could call them the very finest vibration of God's mind or consciousness. But they're too fine to appear in the waking state mind. So those vibrations still appear in consciousness. They still inform the waking state mind, but they don't appear in the waking state mind. And unless, when we dream, the waking state mind relaxes, so it has access to some of the forms, some of the archetypal forms, or the collective unconscious that it doesn't normally have access to in the waking state. And artists are people who do have access to the personal and collective unconscious, not just in the dream state, but in the waking state. And their role in some ways is to bring the contents of the personal unconscious into the waking state. Those are some artists. I would say most artists, they bring the content of the personal unconscious into the waking state mind, but the really great artists bring the content of the collective unconscious into the waking state mind.
And just on that, so what we call nature...
He's very tenacious, isn't he?
What we call nature and the rhythms of nature, could they, in a sense, be a slightly less fine version of the archetypes? The archetypes could also be that which informs the rhythms and the patterns of nature.
Yes. So in a way, when you're looking at nature, you are looking at materializations of archetypal forms.
That's cool.
And you see that particularly when you look at Chinese painting, for instance. You feel that what they're really painting are not material objects, they are painting the energies that underlie nature, not the objects of nature. Look at Fabienne Verdier's paintings. She's a modern contemporary painter who spent many years in China, French painter.
So this question is about the brain and the sense organs in relation to the new model as such. So if I just outline what I understand as the new model, I think we've talked about it before and you've said it this week, but it's that consciousness is the biggest thing within mind, within matter. Within that is matter. And that can be represented by deep sleep, dreaming, and the waking state. And it could also be knowing, which then, as you say, kind of vibrates within itself to produce experiencing, being in the mind, and then that, through thought and perception, produces the duality of the experiencer and the experienced. And so within the consciousness there's timeless, dimensionless. Within mind there's one dimension of time, and then that then proliferates itself to time and space, and therefore the notion of cause and effect as well.
Yes.
So, because it seems like there's a kind of tenacious belief which is loosened greatly, and I don't think I believe it anymore, that thoughts and the brain, that thoughts are produced by the brain. But it seems that the brain is really only an object of perception in the waking state. It's just an object in the waking state. Like we can only ever think of, it's kind of hard to describe. The brain is an image which is a perception, but if we actually go to, therefore, our experience of that, that can be reduced down to perceiving, and then the perceiving can be reduced down to knowing. Yes, am I making any sense? And the same goes with the other sense organs as well, like the organ of the eye as well. We normally think we see with the eye, but
Sorry, go on.
So yeah, that I think.
Go back to Mary and Jane. Yeah, Mary falls asleep. She dreams that she's in Birmingham. She dreams that she's Jane on the streets of London. So the streets of London are what the inside of Mary's mind looks like from Jane's point of view. Yeah. So in fact, the streets of London are they appear from Jane's point of view as matter, but in fact they are the inside of Jane's mind. Inside of Mary's mind. Sorry. Could it be that our brains are what the inside of our minds look like when viewed from a second-person perspective? Just as the world is what God's mind looks like when viewed from the point of view of a second-person perspective, could it be that our brain is what the inside of a finite mind looks like when viewed from a second-person perspective?
It could be.
In other words, just as the streets of London are the extrinsic image of Mary's intrinsic experience, could our brains be what our intrinsic experience looks like from the perspective of somebody else? In other words, from somebody else's perspective, our mind looks like an object made out of matter, just as from our point of view, God's mind looks like a world made out of matter. And that would account for the fact that there is obviously a direct correlation between our minds and our brains. I don't deny that. Change the mind, it registers on a brain scan. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that the brain causes the mind. But there is a connection between the two. Why? Because the brain is what the mind looks like when viewed from the outside. You taste chocolate. Yeah, imagine the taste of chocolate.
Yeah.
And you're having a brain scan. Now the brain surgeon registers you tasting chocolate, but what he sees is something very different from the taste of chocolate.
Yeah.
You experience the taste of chocolate from the inside. He sees your brain waves moving from the outside. So the taste of chocolate is what you experience from the inside. That, from the surgeon's point of view, it looks like brain waves from the outside. So there is a correlation between the taste of chocolate and your brain waves, but that doesn't mean that your brain waves create your experience.
It's just two different ways of describing the same thing.
It's a first-person point of view, that's our internal experience, and a second-person point of view. Just as the world is our point of view, a second-person point of view of God's first-person experience. So this is all the inside of God's mind. When filtered through the limitations of our minds, it appears as a multiplicity and diversity of objects. So the world is what the inside of God's mind looks like from a second-person point of view. Could our brains be what the inside of our minds look like from the second-person point of view? Why not?
And then with the other sense organs, would that be the same representation? It would be the same explanation, I guess, like seeing the first person point of view's perception, but the second person's point of view is the eyes which are perceiving.
Exactly, yes. Yes,
and
you could put it like that.
And that's the same for ears and taste and smells.
Yes.
And touch as well. And I guess the whole body in a sense.
Just like going back to Mary and Jane. Jane believes that she sees the world through her eyes, or she perceives experience through her eyes and her ears and her nose and her mouth. But those organs, they from the inside, from Mary's point of view, Mary doesn't have eyes, ears, nose, and a mouth. She seems to know the inside of her mind through the sense organs of Jane. So for Jane's point of view, it seems that her eyes are doing the seeing and her ears are doing the hearing. But it's not really like that, because it's a Mary asleep in Burlingame that's really doing the seeing and the hearing, and she doesn't have eyes and ears. But from Jane's point of view, it seems that she has eyes and ears, and that the eyes are doing the seeing and the ears are doing the hearing and the nose is doing the smelling.
And I guess that kind of goes for all the organs of the body and the body itself.
Yes. It's not. It's just a model. It's not. I'm not suggesting it's a completely accurate description of experience, but it explains how there is a correlation between the mind and the brain, without implying that the brain produces the mind. It's acknowledging the correlation between the two, but it stops short of saying the brain therefore produces the mind.
And so from the first person, sorry, just because this is kind of interesting. So from the first person perspective, everything is that there's just, is that when there's just seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, thinking, sensing, that's the first person perspective. And the second person perspective is what that looks like from an outside observer.
Yes.
So the first person perspective, if you actually stick with it, is that the experience of, that's mind, that's just all mind stuff, I guess, that's all experiencing. There's no, but from the second person perspective,
it looks like matter.
It looks like matter.
Yes, so from the first person what is made of mind from the first person perspective looks like matter from the second person perspective.
And is that
what is all the inside of Mary's mind looks like matter from the point of view of Jane. From Jane's perspective, the world seems to be made out of matter. From Mary's perspective, it is all mind.
Yes. And that's...
So matter is what mind looks like when viewed from a limited point of view. You get that? Matter is what mind looks like from a limited point of view. God's face, the world, is what God's face looks like when viewed from the perspective of a separate subject of experience. In other words, all this is God's mind, but it appears to be a world made out of matter when viewed from a finite subject, from the point of view of a finite subject. When God's mind is filtered through the limitations of a finite subject, it appears as a multiplicity and diversity of objects. Remember Shakespeare. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as God's infinite being bodies forth its own dimensionless presence, a poet's pen, that is the finite mind, turns it into form and gives airy nothing, God's infinite being, a name and a form, and makes it appear as a world. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as God's infinite being bodies forth its own dimensionless presence, each finite mind turns that presence into objects and forms, and gives to God's infinite being a temporary name and form. Shakespeare is very much more eloquent than I am.
And then, so then the exercise that we've done before, when there's an object, so say for example the flowers, that's the second person perspective. That can then be turned into the first, I'm not sure if this can then be turned into the first person perspective, which is really just seeing, and then that in itself can then get reduced down to knowing. And in the same way, the flowers or the brain are the second person, is that?
Yes. The flowers are your second person perspective of the activity of God's mind. From God's point of view, this is the activity of her mind. From your perspective, It is a bunch of flowers. However, the experience of seeing is the activity of your mind, but from a surgeon's point of view, it looks like brainwaves in your skull.
Yes. I think that makes sense. Because the second person perspective is always a
second
reduced
person
object.
perspective makes mind look like matter.
Yes, yeah.
From the first person perspective, it's all mind.
It's all mind.
From a second person perspective, that activity of mind appears as matter.
And then would you say that, so the first person perspective, that's still not quite consciousness's perspective as such, because consciousness's perspective is just all knowing.
That's true.
Already
that's true.
So it's kind of
Don't make me work too hard.
Zero person perspective, first person perspective, second person.
You're right. You're right. Yes. Yeah. But the zero person perspective. That's dimensionless consciousness in which there is no form. Yes.
And that's kind of like the deep sleep. The first person's like the mind, it's all mind, so the dream, and then the second person is the matter, so it's like the waking.
Yes, you could put it like that.
But it's all really all consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Just vibrating within itself.
Yes, and remember that it is dimensionless consciousness, that's the zero person perspective, who itself assumes the form of both the first person perspective and experiences everything as mind, and then within mind enters into its own imagination to seem to become a second person point of view, from whose perspective its own mind appears as the world. It's a beautiful model, isn't it?
It's lovely.
It's exquisite. It's like a jewel. It's like a jewel within a jewel within a jewel, isn't it?
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's a jewel in which every part is related to every other part. Every part is reflecting off every other part and appearing depending on where you're taking your point of view. It's it's like a fluid jewel within a jewel within a jewel.
And what seems like it seems to be able to take account of both the materialist and the idealist points of view.
Absolutely. The materialist point of view is the second person point of view. The idealist point of view is the first person point of view, and the consciousness only model is the zero point of view, which encompasses both the others, but is beyond both of them.
Yeah, it's good that.
And another way of saying it, which is just, this is for something you to think about in the early hours, and actually you touched on it, the zero, the consciousness, from the pure consciousness's point of view, pure consciousness has no dimensions. The mind only has a single dimension, it only has an extension in time but not space. And from the second point of view, second person point of view, space seems to come into existence. So something that is zero, has zero dimensions, takes the form of something with one dimension, which in time takes the form of something that has three dimensions. So first there is dimensionless consciousness, then time, then space. That's your homework, ponder that.
Thank you.
Keep going, Jake. You are building a model for yourself. And you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and you're trying to fill in, trying to make a map of your experience and trying to connect. You've understood this little corner, and you understood this, you've understood this, but you're trying to make, you want it to be one map, not a series of disconnected moments of understanding. And you're going about it the right way. Just keep going. In time, these apparently unrelated pockets of understanding will begin to join up. You'll fill in the missing parts of the map, and the map will become simplified as it completes. At the moment it seems to be complex. How does this join to this, and how does Mary do this, and how does this and that? And so it appears to be complex, but the complexity is really your attempt to link together these pockets of understanding. And as it's like having a jigsaw puzzle. When you start a jigsaw puzzle, you think, oh my God, it's so complicated. It's 1,000 pieces. And you put in the corners first, and then the edges, and slowly some order, some simplicity begins to emerge from the chaos. And then you fill in more and more. And at a certain point, there's more order than there is chaos. And then in the end, the picture is almost complete. There's just a few loose bits that still have to find. And then you put the last piece in, and it's just one single, simple whole. So you're doing the jigsaw puzzle. You've got the puzzle. You've got the corners. You've got the edges. You're filling in, and you're doing it the right way. Just keep going.